Good afternoon. My name is Ricardo Torres. I am the President and CEO of the National Student Clearinghouse. It is my great honor to be able to help inform your conference on our experience in developing a standards-based research ecosystem. I would like to thank USEF for the opportunity to speak with you today.
So what is the National Student Clearinghouse? The National Student Clearinghouse is a not-for-profit, non-government organization. In our services, we are dedicated to providing the highest levels of information security, confidential portability of student academic data, and serving the entire education community at large. When we talk about the education community, whom are we talking about? Well, within the United States, there are several major stakeholders in the education community, and it all starts with the students. We currently serve over 20 million students that are enrolled in post-secondary education, and we have over 130 million former students that are reflected in our database through either enrollment or degree or certificate records. Schools, we are another important stakeholder. Over 3,700 colleges and universities make use of the National Student Clearinghouse's services, and over 9,000 high schools make use of the Clearinghouse's reporting services to determine what happened to their students once they left high school. We also work with federal agencies such as the U.S. Department of Education. We act as a liaison between the schools and the U.S. Department of Education, for example, when it comes to filing reporting requirements for student loans. We also work with state agencies in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, where we interact with state officials who are trying to learn about the efficacy of their educational programs. We also work with public policy-oriented folks, and you can think of these as think tanks, the Brookings Institution, for example, or the State Higher Education Executives Organization, which works on public policy issues on a national basis, state by state, for higher education. Finally, we work with educational organizations. We work with accreditors, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and you can see Lumina, the National College Access Network, which is dedicated to helping first-generation students in the United States gain access, persist, and complete a college education. We also work with the global education community. We are a part of the Groningen Declaration Network. We work with China, South Africa, Australia, Canada, Spain, and Mexico, just to name a few of the countries where the National Student Clearinghouse has relationships with ministries of education in order to help student data portability. The National Student Clearinghouse was launched in 1993 at the dawn of the Internet age. This makes the Clearinghouse one of the early technical pioneers, a technical disruptor of the status quo. And today, what we have become is an interconnected, voluntary data cooperative. So it's important to note that none of the data that the Clearinghouse receives is because schools have to send it. They send it voluntarily. With that in mind, we have 96% of the U.S. higher education covered within our database. We perform over 1.2 billion transactions a year on behalf of the institutions that we serve. And finally, we generate about $750 million in economic value to these institutions, meaning that if the National Student Clearinghouse didn't exist, there would be an extra $750 million worth of cost in the higher education system. So you can see how this data cooperative yields benefits to the providers of data to the National Student Clearinghouse. As I mentioned earlier, the National Student Clearinghouse began collecting data in 1993 to help solve a paper-driven bureaucratic problem. There you see the institution in the middle of the page and the institution is getting bombarded with paperwork from the National Student Loan Data System. So back in the 1993, in order to figure out whether a student who had a loan could still be in a deferred status, and that student had transferred from one school to another, the process of figuring out where that student was and whether they were still enrolled required a lot of paperwork between entities that were servicing loans, the entities that were guaranteeing the loans, the U.S. Department of Education, the students, the parents, and the institution. The result was a very, very costly paper-driven process that resulted in a lot of technical defaults and a lot of frustration. This was a real problem. And as I mentioned earlier, the formation of the clearinghouse created a technical disruption to this problem and allowed students and administrators to breathe easy and actually get to the business of education. So over the years, our data expanded based on the services that we were providing. So we included enrollment verification services, and these were brought in from our existing enrollment data that was already being collected. So the way you want to think about this is that the schools were already providing enrollment data to the National Student Clearinghouse, and what we did at the request of the registrars was to begin to verify student enrollments, since we already had the data, for textbook companies, laptop companies, where students were looking for student discounts, and their verified enrollment would allow them to have that. At no point is student data sold. It is merely verified at the student's request. We also added degrees and certificates back in 1998, and this allowed the National Student Clearinghouse to take over the degree and certificate verification process for the higher education institutions. So we have many agreements with background checking firms, for example, who will look to verify a claimed degree by an individual at a U.S. institution. And then finally, we provide transfer analytics for schools. Enrollment managers use the National Student Clearinghouse's student tracker reporting services to really understand what's happening to their enrolled students, students they sought to enroll and enrolled elsewhere, students that transferred from their institutions and went elsewhere. They want to understand how many of them ended up getting a degree or are still enrolled. These services are primarily benefiting two basic stakeholders: students and alumni of the institution, and the colleges and universities that provide the data to the National Student Clearinghouse. So once again, you can see there is this exchange of, in this cooperative of data for information. There are two critical elements of success for this ecosystem to work. The first is trust. So over 22 years, the National Student Clearinghouse has built an environment of trust in its data ecosystem. And secondly, a high value proposition, meaning that the universities and the colleges see a tremendous value in providing the data to the National Student Clearinghouse. We do not charge the schools for these services, so they provide us the data, and then we, in turn, can turn it around and provide the economic value that I mentioned earlier. The data that we collect and the services that we provide have strong research-related attributes, and this is a really important point. They are all standard data elements. So in particular, when you're dealing with compliance reporting, it allows us to have standard definitions and standard elements that are collected for all the institutions that send data to the National Student Clearinghouse. Secondly, the currency of the data is the same for all. So since they are all reporting on a compliance basis and on a compliance schedule, the actual data that we receive is current to the most recent month. the clearinghouse, as a matter of fact, closes each month and does not allow for edits to occur once a month is closed. The data is also very accurate. When we receive the data from the schools, we perform a series of edits on that data and automatic checks to make sure that there are no errors. If there are errors found, and there are always errors found, the file goes back to the school, where the school is responsible for correcting the errors and then sending the data back to the National Student Clearinghouse. And then finally, it's near census coverage. So that means that we do not have to do statistical rounding or a statistical proportioning of our information as it is reported in many of our reports. Because of our 96% coverage, our reporting tends to be on a census basis and very accurate. And that makes the researchers very, very happy. So how do you go about building a research brand? Let's talk about this. We focused on 3 areas: quality of the data, relevance of the information, and insights that could be derived. On the quality side, we wanted to make sure that third parties were able to independently validate the information that we had and that the data was seen as clean. Also, we had the currency of our data assessed as well as the coverage. So as we grew in coverage over time, for example, we provided researchers with the ability to understand that as you go back in time, the coverage was less, and therefore you would have to do some statistical rounding in order to be able to get to a census number. But the data that's more current obviously has the 96% coverage area, so you really do have a census environment. So this is really important so that researchers understand how to use the data and that you have a third party independently validating that the data is good and that it's clean. You should also, with your data, have the ability to replicate known measures that are out there and demonstrate that value proposition to the data providers. So if there are known measures of success out there, being able to replicate it shows that your data, in fact, is valid. Secondly, what you want to be able to do is you look at the folks that are providing you that data and answer the question, what is it that we can tell you in addition to the information that you've provided us to help provide some context that allows them to gain some insights, which is the next section, on the data that they previously did not have. So how you do that is you demonstrate the ability to inform at a deeper level. And you have to allow for nuanced data comparisons. So an example of this in the United States is that the Clearinghouse publishes a completions report every year. And this talks about what percentage of students that started 6 years ago, 8 years ago, complete some form of college credential over that time period. We also produce 3 months later a state version of that report, so state by state. States can see what, in fact, the completion rates were. But importantly, we allow for schools to look at that information by querying the clearinghouse and being able to see what their individual completion rates look like compared to the state and national numbers. Now, what makes this an interesting topic to talk about is that the United States has a unique feature in its higher education system, that over 37% of students transfer from one school to another. And in that transfer process, schools do not know, for the most part, where these students end up. And as a result, it ends up creating an environment where completion data, where you have, for example, educated a student for 2 years, and now that student is transferred to another school and completed a 4-year degree, you would like to know that your 2 years' worth of education contributed to that completion. Another area that I'd like to focus on is the research reporting pyramid. keeping your reporting simple. So, we assess that, at least in the United States, to look at outcome data, you probably need about 20 data elements. And these are mostly awards: high school diplomas, certificates, degrees, associate degrees, bachelor degrees, master degrees, PhDs, etc. The next level are correlations, which is really looking at perhaps items such as uniform test data or course data, which could help inform some of the trends that we see in the outcomes. We think that we've been able to successfully put that together with about 150 additional data elements. Now, the final piece is the most complicated, where individual institutions or educational organizations will look to see how they can improve outcomes. And this requires granular information, probably over 1,000+ data elements, to really understand at the base level what you can do to help improve outcomes. So clearly, when you start thinking about the data depth required, you go from the very low level of data required to inform high-level trends to a very high level of data to start getting into conversations around how things can improve. Of course, the importance of that is that in our world, we look to really keep things simple. You need to have data standards, and these are a must, as we discussed earlier. So in the outcomes, we're talking about what is happening. What are some of the trends? What are the benchmarks that are out there? These are important pieces of data for the region, for the countries, and for individual institutions by type of institution. So in the United States, we can provide this information breaking out community colleges, four-year schools, technical schools, private schools, public schools, etc. When we talk about correlations, again, we want to understand what are the major drivers that perhaps are leading to the trends and the benchmarks that we see above. And obviously in the third section, we're talking about how do we improve. So essentially, we help to inform three different questions: the what, in terms of what is happening; the why, in terms of why it is happening; and the how, which is helping folks to understand how do you improve what is going on in the education continuum. The best pieces of advice that I can provide on report design are as follows. First, keep your reports at a high level. Second, even though you're reporting at a high level on a national or regional basis, you should have the ability to disaggregate those reports at least one or two levels down. I think that's really important. Third, keep the scope narrow and focused. Target big issues and large themes. I think what happens is when you get into a room of researchers, a lot of times there's this feeling that you need to boil the ocean all at once. So as you can see in this cartoon, you have someone posting, "My project has become a boil the ocean project. Any advice?" Yes, says the answer, boil it 1 cup at a time. No naming and shaming. What we found, and a lot of studies have shown, that naming and shaming does usually not end in improving results. And as a research entity, you want to earn the right to do more by basically demonstrating that your information is helping to inform. Become the trusted source of data. This is a really important moniker for us. When we set up our research center, we wanted to become the trusted source of data in the United States. If you go to our website, which is the National Student Clearinghouse's Research Center, which is nscresearchcenter.org, that's nscresearchcenter.org, you'll see that we have on our website all the major reports that we produce. Now, importantly, we also focus transparency and visibility. So we focus on who we are. You can learn about the team. You also learn about the projects that we're working under. If you have a project that you're working with the National Student Clearinghouse, you can track that project. And we also have an entire web section dedicated to working with our data. So that's all about data transparency and visibility, and then how to contact us. Collecting data solely for research creates a lot of risk. Some of you may have heard about the George Washington University losing its best colleges ranking. It was ranked number 51 over inflating its data that it was providing to the U.S. News and World Report college rankings. So you have to be really careful with the data. Really importantly, you have to also provide a clear benefit to the institutions. And I'd like to now transition to a video made by the stakeholders about the value that they get from the National Student Clearinghouse system.
Education is the foundation for preparing students to assume their roles as productive citizens. More and more, the educational pathways taken by today's students go beyond the traditional college path and include higher education-enabled technical and vocational pathways. Legislators, student support organizations, and educators continuously evaluate existing programs in order to make improvements that maximize the opportunity for students to achieve their potential. But are current educational pathways and programs effective? It can take years to know if changes made by school systems today translate into long-term success for students. Timeliness requires following the same students throughout their post-secondary careers to find out what is working and capture it in real time.
The information that the Clearinghouse provides is incredibly valuable to school districts because school districts have no other basis, for example, knowing the percentage of their graduates that go on to college other than by surveys that are done and returned by a very small sample of the population. So they are basically guesstimating what they think the percentage of their graduates are that are going to college. On the other hand, the Clearinghouse has the exact information that allows them to tell a school system, a high school within a school system, the percentage of their students that are actually going to college, that are staying in college, and even more important, the percentage of those students that are graduating from college.
Gathering such critical progress and outcomes data is a considerable challenge. Institutions at every level of education must work together to develop a well-defined understanding of available pathways as students map their own journeys through the education system. Even after the data is collected and validated, it must be shared in a way that's meaningful to educators, program administrators, and policymakers. Many high schools and most post-secondary institutions rely on data provided by the National Student Clearinghouse to provide timely answers to crucial curriculum and program effectiveness questions.
The Clearinghouse was established over 20 years ago to alleviate work burdens coming out of the higher education administrative offices, in particular the Registrar's Office. In over 20 years, the Clearinghouse has been able to take on work burdens as an agent of the institution. In exchange for the data that we receive, we perform all of these services for higher education at virtually no cost.
This nonprofit organization has worked with nearly every U.S. post-secondary school for over 21 years, providing trusted services that, as a byproduct, enable it to follow students throughout the continuum of their educational careers.
Data from National Student Clearinghouse has allowed high schools to set ambitious benchmarks over time so that they can hold themselves accountable for some big picture goals as it relates to educational attainment. The other way I've seen high schools use data is to select priority areas, to really drill down in the data to figure out where their highest need priorities are.
The services the Clearinghouse provides to higher education saves the education community more than $500 million annually. Without the Clearinghouse, these costs would be passed on to college students, their families, and taxpayers.
Well, I think at this point in time in our history in higher education, we're really looking at ways that we can track students and track their progress. So the Clearinghouse is able to do that for us in a much more comprehensive way than any single institution can do. So it's about providing 24/7 service and access to students. It's about looking at institutional resources and how we, quite frankly, can better utilize our resources if we take advantage of the services that the Clearinghouse has to offer.
The success of the National Student Clearinghouse depends on the participation of educational institutions. By reporting on student progress, these institutions play a vital role in improving educational outcomes for all students. But collecting and maintaining this data is a massive responsibility. Along with security, protecting students' privacy is the National Student Clearinghouse's top priority.
The data that's sent to the National Student Clearinghouse is owned by the institutions that send it. However, the students are also data owners of their education information. So they have the right to see the information that the Clearinghouse has on them and can dispute it and can also see how it was used.
There are a lot of parent concerns these days, and while the Clearinghouse has been around a long time and has built a great reputation, parents are new to this field. So it's helpful for the Clearinghouse and other organizations to be certified by independent organizations so that parents know they've gotten a seal of approval and that they're doing the right thing to protect student data and make sure it's used in appropriate ways.
The delivery of education is constantly evolving as educators better understand which programs result in long-term success. The Clearinghouse provides educators with the information they need to accurately determine cause and effect in today's continuous learning environment so they can improve student outcomes.
I don't know that there is any other entity in the United States that could provide us with this information. The Clearinghouse has a long history of being a reliable institution. It validates its data, and it allows us to do the work that we do at our own individual colleges and universities. There is no place that I know of that has the kind of depth and record that the Clearinghouse has.
Well, without the Clearinghouse data, it's really like the blind leading the blind. You really don't know what you have. You really don't know what you have achieved. And so you're basically estimating, guessing how your students have done, how your students are doing as they go on to college. Clearinghouse data gives you that exact information. It's incredibly helpful in terms of the school districts shaping, projecting, developing the kinds of programs that will lead to success.
I hope you enjoyed the presentation and the videos. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at rtorres@studentclearinghouse.org. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.